Hi everyone, welcome. I'm Tanya and I'm the editor of The Internationalist. Today we are joined by filmmaker Mila Turajlić, who's made award-winning films such as Cinema Comunisto and The Other Side of Everything. Welcome, Mila.
Thank you for having me.
In today's edition of The Internationalist, Mila and I will discuss her acclaimed documentary diptych Non-Aligned and Ciné-Guerrillas, scenes from the Labudović Reels, which retraces pivotal moments in history where cinema was harnessed for political emancipation and played a powerful role in the battle against colonialism, most notably during the Algerian War for Independence. So, Mila, I'll start from the beginning. As soon as I saw your films, Non-Aligned and Ciné-Guerrillas, I was really illuminated by how they delved into this history of non-aligned movement and then its connection to the Labudović Reels, offering a unique perspective on the birth of the non-aligned movement. So, could you share with our readers what initially sparked your interest in this unexplored vault of films and the story behind it?
Sure. So I've always been interested in the non-aligned movement. It has to do with the fact that in 1989, when I was 10 years old, there was a non-aligned summit in Belgrade, and as school children, we were taken from the school to kind of greet the visiting delegations on the street, and it's something that really marked my spirit. I remember the arrival of Gaddafi with his camels, and it was just something that was a kind of very vivid concept in my kind of political imaginary as a child. And so years later, it's always been somewhere in the back of my mind when I started making documentary films that I would like to make a documentary on this topic. But that didn't mean I had a clear idea of how to, go at the issue or what would be my entry point. And then I met Stevan Labudović, who was 87 years old at the time, and he was the last living cameraman of the Yugoslav newsreels. I knew the archive of the newsreels because already for my previous film, Cinema Comunisto, I had spent many years in this archive. But I didn't know that the Yugoslav newsreels, they're an institution that was very, very similar to Films Division in India, which is it was a state-run government information agency making newsreels that were shown in cinemas. But there was this kind of unexplored part of their holdings, which was material that they had filmed for liberation movements and newly created countries in Africa in the 1960s and 70s. And Stevan Labudović was really a key part of this story. And it's when I met him and realized that he had filmed all of these moments that interest me historically and politically, that I felt like, okay, now I have an idea of how I could tell the story of the non-aligned movement or the birth of the non-aligned movement.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting that you mentioned the films division in India, which I think was known to produce really path-breaking films and has now, with, different regimes coming into play in the political environment of India, has sort of fallen off the radar. And now, with the increase in censorship, there isn't like a lot of movies that are being made that really sort of tackle our political sentiments of the country, and certainly not the left sentiment. I would say like it's the more independent cinema that's coming up that tries to tackle it, but again there's very limited distribution, um, and this sort of brings me to my next question, which was, institutions such as these and the role they play in forming public memory, and their archives and how valuable they are, and not just as a resource for future generations, but also to just sort of come to terms with our own history. So, I mean, they also like help to keep the spirit of these movements that have happened in the past alive as well. So, I mean, as a filmmaker, like, can you speak to the importance of archives like these in preserving and, in a way, rememorializing the struggles and triumphs of liberation movements for future generations?
I really appreciate your question because these archives are very interesting. I actually had the opportunity to come to to India a few years ago and went to Mumbai and visited the films division with the man who was Indira Gandhi's cameraman, who has since passed away. And I actually filmed there with him, really struck by the parallel between Yugoslav newsreels and films division. And absolutely, these are interesting archives because these materials in many ways were created with a very clear political mandate. And that mandate was to document the political, social, economic, cultural, sporting life of a nation. But they're also tools of nation building. They are absolutely, there to provide the kind of unifying, codifying, if you want, image of the story of the national life. And this is absolutely true for the Yugoslav newsreels as it is true for Films Division. And so when you come at this archive with this knowledge and with this understanding that these images are a vector of a political project, then becomes incredibly interesting how you can analyze them and how you can unpack them and how you can actually look at the construction of a political narrative of a country by examining the stories they cover, how these stories are covered, what are the voiceovers, what is it being explained, and how is it being told. And so this knowledge, this know-how that these cameramen and these editors had was then applied as a gesture of technical aid to liberation movements. For Yugoslavia, the story begins in 1959 when a delegation from the Algerian liberation movement, and the Algerian War had started in 1954, and by 1959 was probably at the time the most important anti-colonial conflict taking place in the world. They came to Belgrade asking for assistance, and Yugoslav President Tito, who himself was a successful guerrilla leader, he had led a guerrilla movement against Nazis in the Second World War in Yugoslavia, he promised them aid. He promised them uniforms, he promised them weapons, but he also promised them aid in the form of images, because they were also fighting a propaganda battle where the French were telling the world that what was happening in Algeria was terrorism. These were outlaws, these were bandits, and they needed to get their own version of what was going on in Algeria into the world, which is to say, no, we are a freedom-fighting army. We're not terrorists. And so Stevan Labudović, as the cameraman of the newsreels, whose job was to follow President Tito, was chosen by Tito to go and make a film about the Algerian liberation movement, to provide them with this film narrative of their struggle that they could show at the United Nations. So this gesture of creating political narratives via cinema, via documentary newsmaking, if you want, was something that he had already done in Yugoslavia and was then sent to do in Algeria. And afterwards, in the decades that follow, other Yugoslav cameramen from the newsreels would do the same for Frelimo in Mozambique. And then in 1971, Labudović would be sent to make a documentary film about Yasser Arafat and the PLO. So it's a kind of engagement that went on for decades via the filmed image.
Ja sam znao da to mora davati sloboda. Kad tad. Tako sam im i rekao u Ustar, da ću ja doživjeti, ali će bar nešto ostati. Šta je sve učinjeno da bi se došlo do te slobode? Kako su sve žrtve pale? Eto zato. Eto zašto se s njim.
So, I mean, in a way, these archives are invaluable resource. I mean, they also keep a conversation alive, right? They don't, in a way, let fascist tendencies win, but at the same time, the access to them is so limited, and that's what um, sort of really worries me. I mean, I remember Film Division of India used to release movies earlier through film festivals, and they would organize public screenings, but that just doesn't happen anymore. And we have to sort of rely on independent film festivals to actually look at independent cinema. But coming to Stevan Labudović himself, the man himself, both your films sort of emphasize his significant role in shaping the narratives, even through the films that he's created. And um, and then there is that poignant scene in Ciné-Guerrillas when he visits the museum in Algiers, and he has to, I mean, he sees his own contribution to their history, to contribution to their revolution. And you have these young men who come up to him and they want to take a selfie, and it's a very moving scene. I found it so moving because I could see in his eyes that he now sees that how his work has traveled through time, through countries, and now through generations. So there's a whole new audience here who sort of appreciates his contributions. So, could you elaborate on how Labudović, as a protagonist, even as in the films that he own documented, as you very rightly mentioned in Non-Aligned, influenced your approach to storytelling and the power he held over the narrative?
What's important to say about Labudović, and it's going back to the status of the images, is he was a terrific cameraman. He was probably one of the best cameramen in Yugoslavia, which is why he was chosen to be President Tito's cameraman. And he filmed with a 35 millimeter camera, which was a very rare thing, to go into the maquis with partisans and film it with 35 millimeter cameras. He did in Algeria was an extraordinary thing because it's left us a really extraordinary archive. So just first of all, to say, in terms of the quality of the images that he has left behind, that is already something that is strikingly rare in existing footage of the continent from those 8 years. The second thing that's important to say is, and I say this in Non-Aligned, is to really understand the status of these images and his status. He was a man with a political mission, and he never shied away from that in our conversations. What he's doing is he's documenting reality in some ways, but that's not the primary gesture of what he's doing. He's there to build an image. He's there to build an image of a successful, organized liberation army. And he does that sometimes by staging scenes, sometimes by making the guerrillas reenact certain things. His main problem, as he explained to me, was that in a guerrilla war, actions take place at night. And obviously in the late 1950s, there wasn't a lot of film stock that could film that. So he had to have them do some of these actions during the day, which meant putting the soldiers at risk, but also, like I say, reconstructing things that he couldn't film otherwise. And so all of these are incredibly important filters to bring when looking at his footage. And that's what I was trying to do in my films, was to layer these images with all of these narratives, his narration of what he was trying to do, my narration of how I'm trying to understand and read these images, really to explain or to give the audience a perspective from which they also can unpack these images and not just take them as a kind of historical record, or if you wanted, as a kind of indexical proof of what's being shown on the scene. And so ultimately what I conclude in the voiceover of the film is that he wasn't a witness of an era, he was a protagonist of an era. His role in that era was to build its image, was to provide a filmed image for a political movement that was being born, and a liberation struggle against colonialism. And all of our conversations are centered around this role that he is performing. And I was hoping that, one of the kind of layers that these films are achieving is to give audiences this kind of key for really thinking through the documentary footage of the time. So it has, there's a gesture of kind of media literacy, I think, also taking place. Because I think what we're looking at is, in some ways, the birth of information wars. And I really thought it was important to keep foregrounding who is filming, who are they filming for, why do they have the access to film what they are filming, what is the kind of personal political agenda or motivation that they're bringing to this filming, and to put all of these elements into consideration as you're watching these images.
Otkriju nas. I kad nasta lupanje minobacača, ma to je, nebo se prekrilo od samo eksplozijama. Kad je počeo taj pakleni napad, ja sam marširao spavajući. Sanjam da sam u Rimu, doslovice Rim, u bioskopu i gledam ratni film. I onaj koji je bio iza mene, vidite, Jane, svi su polegli, a ja još sanjam i nastavljam. I samo me tresne od zemlje. Probudim se, a ono, ne da sanjam, nije sala u Rimu, nego stvarnost.
Yeah, I mean, that's really profound. I mean, I'm now reconsidering my own question, because as a protagonist, obviously his own motivations would be influential. And I do remember, I think, a scene in Ciné-Guerrillas where he's attributing some part of his work to propaganda. And I think at that time I didn't really understand it. I wasn't sure what he was referring to. But now that you're coming back to the staging of the scenes, in a way, because of the limitations of film, it kind of makes sense what he was saying. And which also sort of brings me to one of the more intriguing aspects of these two films, which was the way you portrayed kinship that's forged through shared revolutions. And, particularly Labudović traveling to Algeria to film the Algerian Revolution, and not realizing until the end of Ciné-Guerrillas, when he's in his hotel room, and coming to terms with how he was such an important part of their history through his work. And so, could you discuss how newsreels like these, created by filmmakers like Labudović, shape public perception and contribute to the success of revolutionary movements? And I mean, does film as a medium adequately explore and depict these connections between different liberation movements and the way it unites all of them?
I mean, there is something very unifying in the images that he was making, for sure. The newsreels in the 1950s, this is before the arrival of television, were the dominant visual information medium in the world. And cinemas were the place where people would go to see the kind of living, moving bodies of their leaders. So the power of cinema at the time was absolutely undoubtable. And so in this sense, they all knew what a powerful instrument they had in their hands. And they very much understood that they were in a kind of propaganda and counter-propaganda war. They were facing a French media machine. They were facing kind of very dominant Western media after the colonial powers pulled out of many African countries. They didn't leave behind any kind of infrastructure for filming. And even worse, for example, in French colonies during French colonialism, there was something called the Laval Decree, which forbade the indigenous population from filming themselves. They didn't have the right to film themselves. And so they were left without the skills, the infrastructure with which to build their own newsreels, if you want, when the colonial powers pulled out. And this is where Yugoslavia played a role. Not only Yugoslavia, there were other socialist countries that were coming to their aid. But when I looked at documents relating to Yugoslavia's relationship, in particular with Algeria, with Tanzania, with Mali, and with Mozambique, one thing that was kind of really highlighted in these reports is that unlike Soviet aid, Yugoslav aid came without any ideological strings attached. Which is interesting, which is a very interesting thing to start to compare. What were the kind of products of these collaborations? But at the heart of this gesture is kinship, for sure. So there is a kind of political solidarity being expressed in terms of the political relationship under which these collaborations are taking place. But on the kind of basic human level, you have someone like Labudović, who was a partisan in the Second World War. He was working in the photographic units of the partisans in the Second World War. So someone who participated in his own country's struggle for liberation, who then gets engaged and risks his life for 3 years in the Algerian Liberation War, believing in the importance of showing their struggle for freedom. And it's an extraordinary gesture of solidarity. It's an extraordinary gesture of solidarity. And it goes back to the question you were asking about his motivation. He simply deeply believed in the importance of anti-colonial struggle and struggles for independence. And so what I was capturing when I was with him in Algeria and I was filming the way he was being received in Algeria, and you rightly mentioned this beautiful moment where young kids wanted to take selfies with him, is that people really recognize his gesture as one of solidarity, and you used an even more important word, I think, which is kinship. And when I travel to Algeria and say that I'm from Yugoslavia, I'm immediately also drawn into these relationships of kinship, of solidarity, of recognition. I would say even of political recognition. I think there's something to be said when you travel around non-aligned countries and you say you come from Yugoslavia. And Labudović says it in the film. He says the door opens. There is like this moment of instant political complicity that happens, of understanding that I find, even with the kind of, I would say, disastrous failure of the non-aligned movement or its irrelevance today, despite kind of the destiny of the political project, the seeds it has sown in terms of kind of human interaction and recognition, I think, are really profound, or at least that's how I live them. So for me, this idea of exploring how these transnational kinships were born then became an essential reason for wanting to make the films. Because when I traveled to India, when I traveled to Algeria, when I traveled to Egypt, I find that these just strands, these connections, I find that they're real and that they're there on a very human, intimate level.
Yeah, and I mean, I also feel that today's world is also feeling the absence of movements like NAM. And there is no, in a way, if there's no solidarity being shown on such a large scale as it was through NAM. I mean, these bunch of countries, newly independent, standing up to the world powers. And the lack of that solidarity, I think, it's just, it's sad. It's such a huge loss. And I don't know if there is a way in today's time, in today's political climate, to actually bring everyone together like it was before. Like, can there be a NAM again? And can there, be a movement like NAM, remotely resembling it? I'm not sure, but I do believe that films like yours and can, in a way, sort of contribute towards even sparking that I think element of needing this kinship, this solidarity with people across borders. Um, yeah, I mean,
I
that's
think
wishful
but you
thinking.
speak, yes, but you speak to something that I think we're all feeling, and it's absolutely true that for me this lies, I think, at the heart of my desire to tell this story, which is that I think we're all desperate, and I think this is particularly true for the young generation, for a new political imaginary, just a new political horizon. And the fact that the story of Nam has not been told or has been forgotten and is definitely not taught to young generations has really deprived them of a way of thinking about a third way. And I think this is a deliberate thing as well, and just to explore a moment in history where there was a third way and where a number of countries of very different ideologies, very different political systems and ultimately very different political trajectories, which maybe led to the fact that it never genuinely went forward as a movement, but it came together. There was a constitutive moment where this idea, this vision took shape, and I think it was incredibly important for me to bring that back on screen and then to try and show that globally to a younger generation, simply to say there are other political horizons out there. We just need to build them. We need to find them. And, Sukarno says it in his speech when he says it's really about the freedom to be free for our countries.
Quite simply. Yeah, and I do agree with you. They don't teach this to younger generation. I didn't grow up learning about NAM in the way I should have. And there's a lot more I learned after watching your films, a lot of the aspects of the movement that I wasn't aware of at all. So yeah, I'm going to recommend the movie to everyone I meet. And I hope we have a screening in India sometime soon. It'll be,
that's my greatest hope. That's really my greatest hope, to try and bring the films to India.
Yeah, I mean, if I can help in any way, let me know.
Thank you.
I mean, the whole discussion was really insightful, and thank you so much for sharing your work, your vision with us, and making the time.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity to think through all of these questions with you.
And before we part our ways, I'd like to take a moment to invite our readers to share the Internationalist with their friends. By sharing and spreading the word, you'll enable us to produce more engaging interviews like this one, and as well as help build and sustain the progressive international. Thank you, and have a good day.